We're in the Netherlands, in the 15th century, in the workshop of a revolutionary painter, Hieronymus Bosch. There are few remaining traces of his life. By turns, he has been considered a genius, an avant-gardist, and also a heretic, influenced by a secret society. He had access to the rarest documents. He rubbed shoulders with the greatest figures, princes and scholars alike. He was forgotten for 2 centuries, then resurrected, and he is surely the world's foremost surrealist. Only 26 paintings have been left to us, all painted on wooden panels. Most are triptychs, which were displayed in churches. They were kept shut 6 days out of 7, and on the 7th day, Sunday, they were opened to be presented to the faithful. The best known among them is the Garden of Earthly Delights, the most enigmatic work by Hieronymus Bosch. In the centre, little naked figures indulge in the pleasures of life. But on the right, punishment and death lie in wait. This descent into the underworld, into the chaos of hell, contributed to his being dubbed the Devil Maker. But was that really all he was? In all his work, Hieronymus Bosch used medieval symbols, but he broke from the medieval world with his most sacrilegious call for a new man. Nonetheless, the church never bothered him. The Bosch mystery remains intact. We know he was born around 1450 with the last name Van Aken in the Netherlands, in the city of 's-Hertogenbosch. At the time, the city was an important commercial and cultural crossroads in the region, after Brussels and Antwerp. The city was protected by heavy doors to the many canals which funneled traffic towards the centre. Hieronymus Bosch was born into a humble family of painters, originally from Aachen. In the 15th century, the Van Aken dynasty was at its peak, and moved on to the main market square. Bosch lived there first with his family, and then later with his wife. After working in his father's atelier, he had his own, somewhere in the centre of the city. Hieronymus Bosch only left 's-Hertogenbosch once in his life. He didn't travel, although it was customary for artists to do so at the time. The world came to him.
From the evidence of what Bosch's life in 's-Hertogenbosch was like, and from the evidence of his relatives, it does seem that he lived, at least on the surface, a very pious life, a life which involved his membership in the most elite of religious confraternities of his city, and probably one of the most elite confraternities or brotherhoods of his whole northern culture. So we know that Bosch, therefore, was at the heart of what one might call orthodox late medieval piety, based in group activities, but also intensely invested in private looking at who you are and what your inner state is and how sinful you are in a sort of public way, also confession and penance and so forth.
The illustrious brotherhood of Our Blessed Lady brought together the city's intellectual, commercial and political elites and had influence all over Europe. In 1478, the marriage of Hieronymus Bosch to Aled van der Merwen, one of the city's great aristocrats, guaranteed him financial ease and higher social status, and helped him reach the highest level of the Brotherhood. He became a sworn member.
Un frère juré à l'époque de Jérôme Bosch consistait à célébrer très régulièrement des messes et des services religieux dans la cathédrale. Et si je dis très régulièrement, c'était 5 fois par semaine. Il y avait toutes les fêtes liées et dédiées à la Vierge Marie. Après, il y avait des réunions ici dans ce bâtiment avec ses confrères. Ils prenaient des repas ensemble, ils discutaient probablement des points et des sujets religieux et socioculturels également. Il faut peut-être prendre en considération que les membres de cette confrérie à l'époque de Jérôme Bosch étaient des aristocrates, des hommes du monde. Et le signe a été le symbole de la richesse, de la noblesse.
Hieronymus Bosch became the official painter of the Brotherhood. He held banquets in his home and made strong friendships with its members, who came from all over Europe. Religion was indisputably one of the cornerstones of his life and his work. Most of his paintings depict biblical scenes: the Passion of Jesus Christ, hell, saints facing temptation, and Genesis, to be sure to remember the original sin. In his paintings, Bosch used religious symbols common during the Middle Ages and understandable by all at the time. Fish, for example, very present in his work in all its forms, symbolized Christ as our Saviour. The goldfinch symbolizes the passion of Jesus Christ. Legend has it that the bird, seeing Christ suffering under his crown of thorns, tried to remove it. Spattered by the blood of Christ, it was given red plumage in return. From that day on, its head was scarlet, to commemorate the Passion. It is associated with thistle flowers, which symbolize Christ's crown. In the Middle Ages, there were symbols everywhere. In this painting, St. John is alone on the island of Patmos, lost in his vision. At his feet, the eagle watches over the pen and ink he uses to record miracles. On the right, the devil wants to seize them. The fire on his head symbolizes his infernal origins. Bosch gave him short arms to prevent him from snatching the inkpot. His body is composed of hybrid animals bundled together in heavy armor. In the background, a blue-tinged landscape, peppered with marshes, gives depth to the painting by clearly separating the background from the foreground. Here, he transposes his village to represent Greece. In many paintings, versions of 's-Hertogenbosch and its surroundings also serve as the setting for scenes of daily life village games, peasants and fishermen, but also spitefulness, vanity, and the transience of earthly things. Bosch was an attentive observer of daily life and depicted human behavior with precision.
If I were to send a person to one painting to understand all of Bosch's work, I would certainly send them to the so-called 7 Deadly Sins and 4 Last Things in the Prado. What you have is representation of the world, beautiful in its funniness and its careful detailing of what people are like and what people do, in the form of 7 scenes of sin. These aren't allegorical scenes, they're sin enacted in everyday life. A person overeating with his son with a sort of scrofulous hair, trying to get some of the food, and somebody bringing in more food. Enablers, we would call them, for somebody's overeating. All that goes on. So what do we learn from that? We learn that Bosch is the greatest and first genre painter in the history of European art, all those little scenes of everyday life. We know that those genre scenes are about sin, but they're also more than that. They're humorous, cruel, interesting to look at. But we also know that the whole picture that he paints is one which is there to warn you, beware, beware. And that's the essence of Bosch. Every one of his pictures should have a label, beware, beware. Maybe God sees, maybe Bosch sees, maybe the devil sees, but somebody is seeing you before you see them.
Good only exists in relation to evil, and evil in relation to good. Bosch linked the two by using religious symbols known to all. Thus he created an ambiguity which tilts first towards hell, then towards heaven.
God creates first the angels and then mankind. And when he creates the angels, he creates Lucifer, actually the prince of the angels. But Lucifer fights with God, is disobedient. He is filled with hubris, with pride. He wants to be like God. Because of that, God punishes him, is throwing him out of the heavens with all the angels that follow Lucifer. They fall into the earth, and while they fall into the earth, they transform from angels into devilish monsters. That transformative force is the force that infects the entire world, the entire even dream world as we humans want it, and how it transforms God's creation into, if you will, the creation of Lucifer.
We can ask oneself, what part of the Christian message does Bosch most focus upon? Christianity is a religion, we think, of love. Christianity, which also can be a religion of hostility. I would say that Bosch lies over in the hatred side of religion. That doesn't mean he, as a person, necessarily lay at the hatred side of religion. It's meant that his art, as an artist, as a person who makes images, tended to inhabit that darker side of the religious iconography.
Hieronymus Bosch emphasized this ambiguity by including in his paintings esoteric symbols only comprehensible to a few, the initiated.
In the case of the Saint Jerome in Ghent, he's praying, mentally he's focused on the crucifix that he holds in his arms. And this crucifix may very well, and the prayers that he's saying may very well be a protection against what this cave and this strange skull at the top of it may represent, namely the mouth of hell. But actually the suggestion is that this skull is looking at you.
In this painting, the skull isn't the only thing watching us. There's also the owl, motionless and wide-eyed. Its prey are blind, while the owl itself sees clearly into the darkness of the subconscious and into the human soul.
Owls are ambivalent creatures. Sometimes they're seen as symbols of wisdom, but I think on the whole we can say that owls are negative creatures related to the darkness, to night, to very closely to witchcraft. In medieval bestiaries, those books of animals, they're listed with the most abject creatures.
Owls are very present in the work of Hieronymus Bosch. Some experts agree that they represent a kind of artist's signature.
My favorite owl is the owl in at the geometric center of the Eden panel of the Garden of Delights, who looks out at us from the darkness. Very eerie and unpleasant moment in the picture.
Bosch liked the interplay of glances. Sometimes they're clear, and sometimes cleverly disguised.
You see a strange rock physiognomy, of which the contours clearly show a nose, and the snakes forming the individual features of the face are drawn in such a way that you see thick lips formed by a snake, is shaped by strange animals, weird dark forms. If you look at it from the point of view of dream, you start to think, well, this is not just a face, it's actually a sleeping face. You have this strange animal that forms the eye. And he is facing the fountain. It's not just the regular fountain of life that you find in late medieval representations of the creation scene, but it's actually perhaps a fountain of death in disguise, because the black owl in the heart of this fountain was a well-known symbol of the devil.
Hieronymus Bosch's imagination was profoundly marked by the late Middle Ages, when death was omnipresent. In 1463, a fire partially destroyed the city of Sertogenbosch and its cathedral. Hieronymus Bosch was only 13 at the time. All over Europe, the plague, famines and wars ravaged cities and decimated populations, and the church governed through terror. In 1478, it was the dawn of the Spanish Inquisition, the recapture of Muslim territories by Christians, the expulsion of Jews, and the construction of a national identity based on the Catholic faith.
Clearly, Bosch had many special areas of expertise. Definitely an expertise in the machinery of torture and torment, a virtual craftsman's knowledge of how you put together a torture machine, how you might envision the most terrible torture you can possibly imagine. All those imaginings have a kind of dual origin. On the one hand, in the fantastical imagination of an artist, and Bosch is very much one of those artists whose fantasy is most active and who was beloved already in his time for being the master of the fantastical. But there's a real-world aspect as well, where he knows how to build a machine. And the particular machines he builds are often machines of torment, and it does ask the question, how many such machines did he actually see, or how close was he to the machinery of inquiry, of violent inquiry?
Meanwhile, Constantinople fell into the hands of the Ottomans after a relentless siege. Scholars fled the city for Italy, carrying with them precious texts from antiquity.
Bosch paints these symbols of Islam, the crescent moon. He's, I think, anticipating, terrifying his public with the idea of what would the world look like if, in fact, Islam would overtake Europe and all the flags of the different principalities would be taken down and these new flags of the enemies would be unfurled. So the real threat of Islam gets mixed in with the phantasmagorical threat of sin and the devil. During this period, not just with Bosch, but with other artists and writers, there was a strong and accepted level of what one might call anti-clerical sentiment, a sense that the clergy, in the way they lived, in how they acquired wealth, in the fact that they, supposedly being celibate, were in fact engaged in sexual activity, that the clergy and the people who had taken orders were a corrupt order, and therefore it enabled artists, or gave artists an impulse to represent them in critical ways.
In Sertogenbosch, Hieronymus Bosch's life was set to the pace of the religious services of the Brotherhood. To fill its coffers, the church sold letters of indulgence, which allowed the faithful to lessen their penance for their sins. Having witnessed these practices, Bosch gradually distanced himself from Christian morality ruined by a church greedy for earthly possessions, to invent an entirely personal humanist morality. Bosch began to compose his own music. The whole world lives in darksome night, in blinded sinfulness persisting, while every street sees fools existing. They know not folly to their shame, yet will not own to folly's name. Hence I have pondered how a ship of fools I'd suitably equip. That is the first sentence of The Ship of Fools by Sebastian Brandt, printed in 1494, which was virulently critical of society. Hieronymus Bosch too began his own Ship of Fools. 12 people around a table, on a ship adrift. On top of the tree-shaped mast, an owl keeps watch. Meanwhile, in southern Europe, in Italy, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo and Raphael were at their peaks. In the north, the uncontested masters were Van Eyck, Dürer and Holbein. It was the dawn of the Renaissance. Erasmus, a humanist writer, wrote in Praise of Folly a criticism of various social categories, particularly monks and the high clergy. He passionately defended man's free will, reason and faith. Erasmus even wrote, Ego mundi civis esse cupio, I'd like to be a citizen of the world. Thanks to printing, the texts were translated into the people's languages and disseminated throughout Europe. Printing was the work of a German engineer, Gutenberg. The first printed book was the Bible in 1455. The first bestseller was Sebastian Brandt's book, The Ship of Fools.
Bosch takes some of those themes that Sebastian Brandt and the literature of folly produces both in literary and in visual forms, and he introduces it into his work and gives it a new spin. So he takes the form of religious art and he substitutes the usual center of those works, which would be a saint or the Virgin or Christ, with something that is taken from the secular literature of folly.
The funnel worn upside down on his head marks the man as a doctor for lunatics. He slices his patient's skull with a knife to extract the stone of madness. Here it's not a stone, but a flower, a tulip. The book the nun is wearing on her head symbolizes the erroneous use made of medical knowledge. The extraction of the stone of madness shows the credulity, the absurdity, which leads men in the hands of a charlatan surrounded by dubious religious figures.
Bosch shows religious figures engaged in sinful activities in what are clearly negative scenes, and also that in general his work has a feeling that church art itself is a problematic entity. For example, in The Temptation of St. Anthony is a world where all the religious artifacts are all cleared away, and piling in are devils and heretics and enemies.
Sometimes in Bosch's paintings, religious symbols are discreet, giving way to his extraordinary imagination. His works are alive with bizarre creatures, monsters, and countless hybrid animals of all kinds. Nonetheless, Hieronymus Bosch's extraordinary imagination was fed by the knowledge of the time. Through the Brotherhood, he met many scientists, philosophers, and artists from all over Europe. He was drawn to humanist circles, to Erasmus's thinking, to Thomas More, and to new scientific discoveries. Bosch certainly had access to a treatise by Polish astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus well before its publication in 1530. Copernicus demonstrated that it wasn't the Earth, as it was believed at the time, but the Sun which was at the centre of the universe, and that the planets revolved around it. That implies a world order in which humans were no longer at the centre of everything. In his paintings, Bosch alludes to this revolution, this absolute challenge to the Church's explanation of the world through the observation of the stars. Europe went from a closed world to an infinite world. In 1486, the Sultan of Egypt presented a giraffe to Lorenzo de' Medici. It was the first giraffe in Europe. The Medici court in Florence immediately invited sketch artists to come and draw it. It was a young giraffe, which had a habit of eating the flowers on the second-floor balcony. The giraffe in the Garden of Earthly Delights is an exact copy of one of the drawings from the court of Lorenzo de' Medici. In 1492, Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic in search of a new route to India, and he discovered the American continent.
We do know that Europe-wide, those stories about landfall, that it couldn't have passed an artist interested in the imaginary and interested in the global and picturing the global as Hieronymus Bosch. There was a time when Bosch was believed to have been a provincial painter, painting either for himself or for a small group of initiates, all deeply religious. And this might have been the case early in his career, but there's no evidence for it. What we do know is that Philip the Fair of Burgundy, the founder of the Habsburg dynasty and the most powerful man in Northern Europe at the time, commissioned a work from Bosch representing the Last Judgment, and he prepaid him for that picture, which is unheard of at the time. And we do know that Philip II of Spain, who was this obsessive collector of Bosch, had this painting, Seven Deadly Sins, in his place of prayer in the monastery of El Escorial. And if you ever go to the Escorial and walk through the king's chambers, you'll see that that room lies in the center between, on the one hand, his ability to see into the sacred space of the basilica and watch Mass being celebrated. And the other hand, he's able to see out a window out towards the Spanish countryside, and beyond that towards the world over which he rules. And between those two worlds lies the enigmatic picture.
King Philip II of Spain bought 5 paintings from him, contributing to his renown. The artist's workshop expanded. He worked with many painters, including his brother and his nephews. He adopted the artist name of Bosch in honor of his city, Sertogenbosch, of which he became one of the most respected men. Although they are rare, documents attesting to this have been found.
Bosch is certainly a revolutionary artist in many, many regards. Not just the fact that the imagination is given this huge palette of expression in his art, but I think also things that are rarely talked about but are immediately apparent, namely in the way he paints. Bosch is inarguably the first great artist of drawings in the entire European tradition. There are other artists who drew, most famously Dürer, amazing artist as a draftsperson. Leonardo did amazing drawings that treat the whole sheet of paper as a little world, and that do so with the spontaneous form of invention.
The triptych of the Garden of Earthly Delights is the perfect example. His painting is brimming with fabulous drawings, which transport us into the fantastic world of Hieronymus Bosch. For this painting, commissioned by one of the Counts of Nassau in Brussels around 1500, Bosch drew inspiration from a very famous poem of the time, The Romance of the Rose. It's the story of a man who dreams of entering a garden to court his beloved. He has to face his inner demons, represented by allegorical figures.
The painting seemed to play with our imagination, with our visual memories of what we had seen of other images at the time. If the painter plays this game with us, then we start to understand that this is more like a machina. It's a machine. It's a memory and imagination machine that not necessarily wants to bring home one particular point, but allows us and actually stimulates to create a whole variety of interpretations. So it is like a television program, not just one single episode, but a 7-year series of all kinds of episodes and events that happen at the same time in this one single painting.
The left panel shows paradise on Earth, architectural mountainous landscapes with animals from another place, a giraffe, an elephant, a white unicorn symbolizing power and purity. Adam is sitting at the foot of the tree of knowledge. God, holding her by the hand, introduces Eve. Behind her, a little rabbit, a symbol of the fertility to come. At the bottom of the frame, a few hybrid monsters, accompanied by a black unicorn, the most evil of unicorns. The fall exists within paradise itself. The right panel shows hell. Humans are prey to beasts, demons, and other men. In the center, the tree man turns back to us as though to ask a question. What have we done to the world? In the painting, it's the central panel which is the most enigmatic. It teems with hybrid animals in lush nature, giant strawberries and grapes, sumptuous flowers, but above all, a crowd of naked young people, perhaps Adam and Eve's children, delighting in the pleasures of the flesh.
The eroticon aspect of the painting gives our whole process of understanding, of interpretation, this sucking out of the nectar of meaning, not just a kind of a mental aspect, but it turns it entirely into a bodily, synesthetic event where all our senses are involved. So this painting involves, if you will, as much our interpretive capabilities of our nose and our taste and of our hands as much as of our mind. The center, you see this blue fountain, and if you look very carefully, it also has a hole in it. Namely, there's a woman who is, forgive me the language, taken from behind by another person, while a person standing next to her reaches with his hand to her vagina. And while she is pointing with her left hand to the arse of another man, a naked man, who has turned his arse towards her. The painter does not rely too much on the imagination of the viewer, but actually depicts a sexual act of a dubious nature that, if you will, is an emblem of what is going on in more imaginative fashions all throughout the Garden of Earthly Lights. Bunch of men, naked men, making all kinds of weird gestures, strange postures and poses, standing on strange animals, riding strange animals, swirling around a pool of naked women. We know from late medieval images that there was a particular habit in court festivities to ask a woman to hold an apple or another treasure in her hand. She would stand in the middle, and then the courtiers would be invited to dance around her, making all kinds of strange gestures. And the man who would make the weirdest gestures would win the prize. The prize is not only the fruit that the woman has in her hands, the prize is the woman as the fruit.
Il s'est permis de peindre toutes sortes de scènes plutôt obscènes, pour ne pas dire peut-être légèrement pornographiques. Et ce qui est étonnant, c'est que l'Église, en tant qu'institution, n'a jamais même dit un mot vers Jérôme Bosch en disant « Écoutez, maintenant vous allez trop loin dans votre peinture, dans vos symboles ». Ça, c'est une chose qui est assez intéressante, pour ne pas dire étonnant, d'autant plus qu'on croit que ce Jérôme Bosch a été un homme très croyant.
Despite Hieronymus Bosch's virulent criticism of the Church, it never took aim at him. He passed away in 1516, probably from the plague, leaving no descendants. At his funeral, his coffin was carried through the doors of St. John's Cathedral by members of the Brotherhood. His work was so popular that right after his death, many artists inspired by his paintings followed in the master's footsteps. It's sometimes even hard to tell whether a given work is by a follower or by the master himself. Hieronymus Bosch inspired Salvador Dali, Magritte, and a great many others. André Breton saw him as a total visionary, writing, "His work, forgotten no longer, challenges the very foundations of the art of painting." Five centuries after the death of Hieronymus Bosch, his most famous painting is undoubtedly the most viewed in the world. The Garden of Earthly Delights continues to inspire new interpretations and resonates today more than ever.
And I think that this painting occurs most naturally when you stand in front of the painting with a group of people, not by yourself. You are being asked to engage in a conversation with other people about the painting. The term conversation means not so much speaking to each other, but being engaged in bodily and corporeal activities, especially play, especially when it regards the conversation about love. It does not represent the imaginary world of the painter, but it represents the imaginary world of the people. So it is your and mine and everyone's mental world that he somehow tries to capture in this painting rather than his own imaginations.
Could the Garden of Earthly Delights still hold secrets? At the top of the central panel, water forms a human shape lying in the landscape, reminding us of the Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci, the original Renaissance man. Just like him, Bosch was always able to convey the upheavals of his time, the violence, discoveries, and ideas about faith. Aren't humans still the same, after all? Aren't they driven by the same passions? Don't they burn with desire? Don't they seek a justice greater than that of men? Don't they dare rise up against injustice and abandon? And doesn't the devil Bosch have angel's wings?